In the cold wind of Wyoming, 1883, where wooden cabins stood like lonely sentinels across endless white plains, a man named Ethan Walker lived alone, a quiet cowboy with a weathered heart. He carried years of silence and loss in his eyes. Then one morning, a letter arrived sealed with lavender wax from the Western Bride Agency. 3 days later, a stagecoach stopped at the edge of town, and from it stepped a woman frail, thin, her face marked with a fading bruise, a single note trembling in her hand. "Please, I just need a safe place. If it were you, standing there in that frozen land, would you open your door to a stranger whose eyes carried both fear and hope?" Ethan did. He looked at her, this wounded soul from faraway Boston, and said the words that would change both their lives forever. "You're not alone now. But can kindness truly heal what cruelty once destroyed? Can love bloom in a world built on survival? This isn't just a love story. It's a story about redemption, about two broken hearts finding warmth in the harshest of places and learning that even on the edge of the world, grace still lives." Join us for Cowboy. Found a mail-order bride with a bruised face. He said you're not alone now. A story that doesn't make you weep from tragedy, but from tenderness. If stories of humanity, courage, and quiet love move you, please like, share, and subscribe to stay with us for more tales from Frontier Hearts. The wind moved across the high plains like something alive, carrying with it the taste of iron and snow. Out here, time didn't so much pass as it lingered caught between the cry of a hawk and the groan of the barn door that never quite shut right. Ethan Walker had lived alone for 3 winters on that stretch of Wyoming earth. 32, though the mirror in the washroom said 38. The land had a way of etching its own handwriting into a man's face lines drawn by wind, by loss, by the long habit of silence. Each morning he rose before the frost loosened its grip, lit the stove with pine scrap, and poured black coffee into a tin cup that had lost its shine. There were no voices in the house, only the ticking of the mantel clock that used to belong to his mother, and the soft breathing of the mare in the lean-to. Sometimes he'd speak aloud, just to hear something human bounce back off the log walls. It had been the kind of winter that tested both cattle and men. 2 steers gone to the cold, a fence collapsed under snowdrift, and 1 night of fever that nearly took him. When spring finally cracked open, Ethan stood at the porch rail and realized he hadn't touched another soul in months. The horizon was wide enough to break a heart. He thought of the advertisements he'd seen in the Rock Springs Sentinel mail-order bride's companionship for settlers, reliable agency in Boston. The words seemed foolish at first, like asking heaven to send a miracle through the post. But loneliness is its own kind of hunger. One evening, with the lamp burning low, he sat at the table and wrote a letter in his careful, uneven hand. To whom it may concern. My name is Ethan Walker. I have a small ranch near Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory. I'm 32 years of age. Not a drinking man. The winters are hard, but the view is honest. I seek a wife willing to build a quiet life. I can offer shelter, fair wages for her work, and respect. He signed it, folded it once, and sealed it with the heat of a match. When the reply came, 2 weeks later, the envelope carried a faint scent of lavender that didn't belong in this country. Inside, a note in neat, deliberate script. Dear Mr. Walker, my name is Clara Bennett, age 27 from Boston. I wish to leave behind a difficult situation and begin anew. I can read, sew, and keep house. I value honesty above comfort. The agency says you are quiet but honorable. That's all I hope for. Clara Bennett. He read it 3 times before he believed it real. A woman from the East Boston, no less, would be arriving in Willow Creek within 3 days. The letter trembled slightly in his hand, though the room was still. Ethan looked around his house with a soldier's eye. The place was serviceable, but bare a table, 2 chairs, a stove that smoked when the wind came north. He swept the floor twice, wiped the soot from the window panes, even patched the quilt on the bed in the spare room. Then he built a second chair from scrap pine, though the legs came out uneven. Cooking was another matter. He tried biscuits first, burning half and underbaking the rest. The stew turned thin, so he thickened it with flour until it could stand a spoon upright. He imagined her sitting across from him, polite enough to eat whatever he served, and felt a strange embarrassment rise in his chest. No one had been inside this house since his mother passed no one to see the little failures of an ordinary man. That night, he polished his boots, then paused before the mirror nailed above the basin. The man who looked back was leaner than he remembered, eyes the color of rain clouds, beard shading toward gray at the chin. He thought of how the years had slipped away, not in grand adventures, but in chores repeated until they became prayer. "I reckon she'll turn right around once she sees this face," he muttered, half smiling, but something inside him, small and stubborn, whispered otherwise. He lay awake long after the lamp went dark, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods. It had been so long since he'd waited for anyone that the act itself felt foreign, like rediscovering an old word whose meaning you thought you'd forgotten. Hope, that was the word. The next morning he rode into town for supplies. Flour, sugar, and a length of blue ribbon he didn't explain to the storekeeper. The stagecoach would come through Willow Creek on Friday, dust trailing behind it like smoke from another world. Until then, he busied himself with work mending the corral, oiling the hinges, pretending it mattered if the porch boards gleamed. But beneath each movement ran a quiet pulse, a tremor he didn't name. He caught himself glancing east whenever the horizon shimmered with heat. Somewhere beyond that line of sky, a woman was traveling toward him, carrying her own ghosts. Sometimes, while stacking hay, he'd imagine the sound of her voice, not words, just the cadence, a gentle Boston rhythm meeting the slow drawl of the plains. It wasn't impossible music, yet it steadied him. On the evening before her arrival, the air turned cold again, sharp as glass. Ethan stood outside the barn and watched the sun sink behind the hills. The world was painted in copper and blue, the kind of light that made even the rough edges of life seem worth keeping. He remembered a fragment of his own letter, "I can offer respect." It had seemed such a small promise when he wrote it. Now it felt like the truest thing he could give. Later, by the stove. He poured himself a final cup of coffee and opened her letter once more. The lavender scent had faded, replaced by smoke and leather, but the words were still there, steady, brave. He thought of the journey she must be making. Crowded coach seats, the jostle of strangers, the long miles of dust between Boston and Wyoming. Whatever she was running from, he hoped this land might let her rest. The clock struck 9. Outside, coyotes called to one another across the ridge, their voices thin and wild. Ethan smiled faintly. Even they sounded less lonely tonight. He set the cup down, folded his hands, and whispered, not a prayer exactly, but close enough. 3 days. He said into the quiet, 3 days. And the house won't echo so much. The morning the stagecoach came to Willow Creek, the sky hung low and pale, as if winter had left its breath behind. A thin veil of dust floated over the main street 2 saloons, a general store, and the wooden depot where the coach stopped once a week. Ethan Walker waited there, hat in hand, his thumb tracing the brim as though smoothing his nerves. He had been up since dawn. The horse was brushed, the wagon scrubbed of mud, his boots newly blacked with oil. Still, he felt unfit for company. The last time he'd stood waiting for someone was at his mother's grave, and this had the same hollow stillness. Only now, there was a pulse of expectation beneath the quiet. The coach appeared around the bend, wheels throwing up dust, the driver cracking his whip at a pace too fast for decency. Ethan watched it roll him in, watched the faces pressed against the glass travelers, looking for a fresh start or a place to disappear. He wondered which one she was. When the horses finally stopped, the driver swung down, cursing under his breath. "Mail order bride for Walker," he barked. Ethan nodded. "She's in the back. Been quiet the whole way from Cheyenne." The door opened with a creak. Out stepped a woman small enough to seem swallowed by her coat. Her dress was travel-worn, hem frayed from dust and gravel, but it was her face that stopped him. One eye was darkened with a bruise fading to yellow, the kind that told a story better left unspoken. For a heartbeat. Ethan couldn't move. She looked up, then Clara Bennett. The name from the lavender-scented letter now had a living face, pale and tired but steady. Her gloved hands clutched a satchel to her chest. She hesitated before speaking, her voice a soft tremor under the noise of the town. "Mr. Walker," he tipped his hat, words catching in his throat. "Yes, ma'am." She reached into her coat pocket and held out an envelope. "From the agency," she said quietly. "They said you should read it before deciding anything." He opened it there, dust swirling between them. The paper bore the agency's seal in the handwriting of a woman's hand, neat, formal, final. "Mr. Walker, Miss Bennett is not merely seeking marriage, but safety. Circumstances in Boston make her relocation urgent. You are selected because the agency trusts your good character. Should you accept her under your roof, do so with the understanding that what she needs most is not a husband first, but peace." The note ended without signature. Ethan folded the letter once, slowly, and looked at her again. The bruise, the stillness, the way her eyes seemed to measure whether he was danger or mercy. He felt something shift inside him, not pity, not yet love, but the deep, wordless recognition of another soul trying to survive. He cleared his throat. "Miss Bennett." He hesitated, searching for words he'd never practiced. "You're not alone now." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She blinked once, and something in her gaze softened, a quiet disbelief. Maybe hope's first flicker. The wind picked up a curl of her hair, loose from the pins, and carried the scent of road dust and lavender toward him. They loaded her small trunk into the wagon. She climbed up without help, though her hands trembled. Ethan noticed she sat straight, not touching the seat beside him, as if proximity itself required permission. He gave the reins a soft flick, and the horses started down the dirt road toward his ranch, the sound of the stagecoach fading behind them. Neither spoke for some time. The land stretched wide and bare, sagebrush, cottonwood, a hawk tracing circles overhead. The only rhythm was the clatter of wheels and the whisper of wind against the wagon boards. He stole glances at her, but she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. After several miles, he said, "There's a spare room in the house. You'll have privacy. I'll see that you're comfortable." She nodded faintly. "You don't have to call me Miss Bennett," she said after a pause. "Clara's fine." "All right," he answered. Ethan will do for me. She almost smiled at that brief, uncertain curve of the mouth, but it was gone before he could hold it. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the grasslands. A small herd of antelope darted across the plain, their movements swift and silent. Ethan found himself wanting to tell her something, anything to break the distance, but the right words were rare currency out here. So he said what truth allowed. "It's quiet land," he murmured, hard but honest. "Nothing here asks more than you can give." Her voice came softer than the wind. "That sounds like mercy." He glanced at her, saw the bruise again in that light, the faint tremor in her jaw as she turned away. "Nothing that hurt you before," he said, "will happen here." She looked at him, then truly looked and said, almost to herself, "I'm not used to kindness." The words settled between them, fragile as glass. Ethan wanted to answer, to say that kindness wasn't something a man bragged about. It was something he did, quietly, like fixing a roof before rain came. But he only nodded, tightening the reins slightly. The horses trotted on, and the miles slipped beneath them. By late afternoon, the hills gave way to the open flat where the Walker Ranch sat, a modest cabin, a barn, a line of cottonwoods marking the creek. Smoke rose from the chimney he'd cleaned the night before. Clara's eyes followed the curve of the roofline, the fields beyond, the clothesline trembling in the breeze. For a woman who had come from city streets, it must have looked like another planet. He helped her down from the wagon, though she barely weighed enough to need the assistance. The air smelled of pine sap and distant rain. Inside, he showed her the small room beside the kitchen, a bed freshly made, a washstand, a window looking east. She touched the quilt with cautious fingers. "If it suits you," he said, "you can rest a while. Supper'll be simple, but warm." She turned toward him, and for the first time he saw her smile, not broad, not easy, but genuine. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not asking questions." Ethan nodded. "Questions can wait. Supper can't." When he stepped back outside, the sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the sky in copper and rose. He leaned on the porch rail, listening to the faint clatter inside, the sound of her setting down the satchel, maybe removing her bonnet. For the first time in years, he realized the house no longer felt empty. "You're not alone now." He hadn't meant for it to sound like a vow, but maybe that's what it was. A promise born not of romance, but of recognition that two broken people could still build something steady between them. Out here, where the land took everything unnecessary, maybe that was all a man could offer. He watched the last of the light fade, hands resting on the rail. The wind moved across the plains again, softer this time, carrying the scent of lavender faint as memory. And somewhere inside, he heard her steps on the wooden floor, small, careful, but real. The house, for the first time, had another heartbeat. The road stretched west, a narrow trail of rutted earth winding through pale grass and wind-polished stone. The afternoon light had softened to amber, brushing the hills in gold. Ethan Walker held the reins loose in his hands, careful not to jolt the wagon as it rolled toward his ranch. Beside him sat Clara Bennett, still, upright, and silent. The town of Willow Creek was a memory now, fading behind them like a dream she hadn't quite believed. Ahead lay miles of empty land, and beyond that, whatever life waited for her in the Wyoming territory. He glanced at her once. The bruise on her cheek had deepened under the daylight, violet where it met the hollow of her eye. She caught him looking and turned away. eyes fixed on the horizon. The gesture wasn't rude, just practiced. A woman who'd learned that silence could be armor. Ethan cleared his throat softly. "There's a place at the edge of the creek, maybe 6 miles yet. That's home." She nodded, but didn't speak. He studied her hands instead, gloved and folded tightly in her lap. A fine Boston lady, by the shape of them, not built for rains or washing or mending fences. And yet she'd come all this way, alone. That thought carried both sorrow and respect. The horses trotted at an even pace, hooves thudding against packed earth. Around them, the country opened wide sagebrush, cottonwood, a sky too large for the eye to hold. He remembered once thinking this land would swallow him whole. Now he hoped it might shelter someone else. "After a long while," she said quietly. "You didn't ask what happened." He didn't look at her. "Didn't seem my place." A pause, then a small breath that might have been relief. "Most men can't help asking," she murmured. Ethan shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. "You'll find I'm not most men." For a few miles more, there was only the sound of wind in the grass. Then, almost to herself, she said, "The man who did this, he won't follow. He thinks I'm dead." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Then you can live," he said. "That's enough for now." She looked at him, studying his profile against the sinking light. "You don't talk like men I've known. Maybe that's for the best." When the wagon reached the ridge, the land fell away to reveal a small valley below a strip of green where the creek shimmered like a silver thread. At the far end stood a cabin, smoke rising faintly from its chimney. Fences outlined the pasture, rough but honest. Clara's eyes followed the view with a quiet wonder. "It's peaceful," she said softly. "Peaceful and stubborn." Ethan replied, "Like most things that last out here." They reached the yard just as the sun brushed the horizon. Ethan set the brake and climbed down first, offering a hand. She hesitated before taking it. Her fingers were light, cold through the fabric of the glove, as if unsure whether touch itself was safe. He steadied her until she found her footing. "This way," he said, lifting her trunk with ease. "You can rest soon." The cabin door opened with a low creak. Inside, the air held the smell of pine resin and wood smoke. The small front room was tidy 2 chairs, a stove, shelves lined with jars and tools. To the right, a narrow hallway led to a closed door. Ethan set the trunk beside it. "That's your room," he said. "You'll find a basin and some linens. The latch works from the inside. I made sure of that." She turned toward him, surprise flickering across her face. "A lock, not a lock," he said gently. "Just a way to feel safe." Clara's gaze lingered on him a moment longer, then drifted toward the window. Outside, the plains glowed under the last of the sunset. "It's been a long time since I felt safe." He nodded once. "Nothing that hurt you before will happen here." The words came simple, unadorned, but they landed heavy in the quiet room. She looked down, one hand brushing the fabric of her skirt. "I'm not used to kindness," she whispered. Ethan took a slow breath. "Then we'll start there." He left her to settle and went to the barn, the way a man does when feeling too much. The sky had darkened to deep blue, the first stars waking overhead. He forked hay into the stalls, listened to the steady sound of the horses eating. Work had always been the surest prayer he knew. Through the open door he could see the light in her window, a small, golden square against the dark. A woman's presence. Quiet, but real. The cabin no longer seemed just timber and nails. It felt lived in. He couldn't remember when he'd last felt that. He thought about her words. "I'm not used to kindness." He wondered how many times she'd been made to apologize for surviving. He didn't know how to heal something like that, but he could offer steady ground. Sometimes that was all the frontier asked of a man. Later, inside, he built a fire and set a pot of stew on the stove. The smell filled the room, beef, onion, the faint char of bread warming beside it. He placed 2 bowls on the table, then hesitated. The last time he'd set 2 places had been years ago. When she entered, her hair was loose from its pins, a few strands framing her face. The bruise was still there, but in the firelight it looked softer, almost fading. She seemed uncertain about where to sit. "Anywhere you like," he said. "This house doesn't stand on ceremony." She smiled, a little tired, but genuine. In Boston, everything did. Boston and Wyoming speak different languages. She sat then, folding her hands in her lap. "And what language do you speak, Mr. Walker?" Ethan met her eyes. "Plain English," he said, "mostly with my hands." Her laugh was small, surprised, and gone almost at once. But he caught it, that sound a fragile spark against years of quiet. They ate in companionable silence after that. The only noise, the crackle of the fire, and the wind brushing against the window. When she finally excused herself for the night, he rose and tipped his hat out of habit. "Sleep easy, Clara." She paused in the doorway, glancing back. "Good night, Ethan, and thank you." He sat alone for a long time after she'd gone, listening to the faint creak of floorboards above. Her light went out, but the house still seemed to glow. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow, promising another hard season. He knew what that meant: work, cold, silence. But now there was something else waiting between those things, a heartbeat, soft but steady. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. Nothing that hurt you before will happen here. It was a vow made without ceremony, spoken to no one but the night. Still, in the quiet, it felt like the start of something honest. The first thaw of spring came quietly that year. Snow melted in rivulets down the slope behind the cabin, gathering into a slow, singing creek. Each morning, Clara Bennett woke before sunrise and opened the shutters to watch the mist roll low across the valley. It was the kind of sight Boston never offered, nothing polished, nothing deliberate. Just the world, breathing. Ethan Walker had already been up for hours, as he always was. She would hear the barn door creak open, the steady rhythm of boots crossing gravel, the low murmur of his voice to the horses. There was comfort in that sound, a man speaking kindly to creatures that couldn't answer. It told her the day had begun. Her first weeks on the ranch had passed like stepping into cold water. Every task was new, every silence uncertain. She had burned bread, spilled milk, cried once when she found a bird trapped in the stovepipe. But the land, with its endless patience, taught her slowly. The air here was cleaner than she remembered air could be, and the work, though hard, had a purpose that healed her. By March, she could gather eggs without the hens fussing, knead dough until it rose even, and coax a weak calf to drink from a bottle. The bruise on her face had faded to the faintest shadow, something time would soon erase. When she looked in the mirror one morning, she realized she'd stopped flinching at her own reflection. Ethan never mentioned the past, hers or his. He spoke when words were needed and worked when they weren't. That was something she understood, how quiet, could mean safety. They shared the days like two travelers camped by the same fire, keeping warm without crossing the flame. One evening, while she scrubbed the supper dishes, Ethan came in from the yard carrying a crate of seedlings. His hands were rough, soil pressed deep in the lines. "Figured we could start a small garden," he said, setting them by the window. "Tomatoes, maybe beans. Soil's good this side of the house." She looked up, surprised. "You mean we?" He shrugged, faint smile under his beard. "Ain't much grows if it's left to one pair of hands." That night, she planted beside him, knees in the dirt. The air smelled of thawing earth and pine smoke. He dug rows while she pressed each seedling into its place, gentle as a prayer. Neither spoke much, but the silence had changed. It was no longer absence, it was peace. When they finished, he stood, brushing off his gloves. "That's good work," he said. "Come summer, we'll see the colors you miss." "What makes you think I miss color?" she asked. He looked toward the setting sun, where the light touched her hair in copper tones. "Everyone who's run from the city misses color," he said softly. "Out here, it finds you again." The days fell into rhythm. Mornings were for chores, afternoons for the long work of mending fences or tending to the animals. Sometimes, when the sun was high, Clara would bring him lemonade in a chipped mug. He'd nod in thanks, and she'd sit nearby, never too close, never far. Words were few, but the quiet stretched easy between them. She learned the language of the ranch, the call of hawks, the crack of frozen wood, the slow breathing of cattle at dusk. Each sound carried its own kind of company. She began to hum while she worked, tunes without words, half lullaby, half memory. Once, Ethan heard her through the open window and paused his hammer mid-swing. He didn't say a thing, but that night he fixed the window latch that had been sticking since winter. Small gestures, the kind that said more than talk could. At supper, they ate together at the same table, though the space between their chairs always stayed respectful. He'd ask about the hens, or whether she needed flour from town. She'd ask how the mare was healing. The conversation never strayed deeper, yet something tender lived beneath it, like roots growing under frost. One evening, a storm rolled down from the mountains. Wind rattled the shutters, and rain beat the roof like a drum. Clara was mending a shirt by lamplight when Ethan came in, dripping wet. "Fence post gave way," he said, shaking off his coat. "Cattle'll wander if I don't fix it. Come morning." She looked up, worry quick in her eyes. "You'll catch your death out there." He chuckled, low and rough. "I've caught worse." Then, quieter. "Don't fret. It's part of the life." She set aside the needle and poured him a mug of coffee. Hands steady now in a way they hadn't been months before. When he took it, their fingers brushed a brief, human warmth. Neither of them moved for a heartbeat. "Thank you," he said finally. "For what?" "For remembering I'm human," he answered. "Sometimes I forget." "Later, when the storm passed." She lay awake listening to the creak of the cabin and the faint sound of him moving below. She realized she no longer feared the noises of the night. Every sound meant something was alive, and alive meant safe. By late spring, the ranch had settled into its quiet order. Clara's garden began to sprout, green shoots pushing through brown soil. The hens clucked contentedly, and milk filled the pail in smooth rhythm each morning. Her body, once frail, had grown stronger. Her laughter, rare and soft, began to visit again. And yet, one thing remained undone: the paper from the Western Bride Agency, folded and tucked in a drawer. Their names stood side by side, waiting for signatures that never came. Sometimes, when the evening light turned the room to gold. She would glance at that drawer and wonder. The thought of marriage no longer frightened her, but it wasn't what she needed most. Safety had come first. Affection, maybe, would come later. Ethan never pressed the matter. If he noticed her lingering glances, he said nothing. He seemed content to let time do the slow work of mending. Perhaps he understood that love, like land, could not be forced, only tended. One Sunday afternoon, she found him by the creek, mending a bridle. The light fell soft on his shoulders, and for the first time, she saw not the solitary figure she'd met in town, but a man capable of gentleness. He looked up, met her gaze, and gave a small nod. "How's the garden?" he asked. "Coming along," she said. "Like me, I suppose." He smiled, a quiet, knowing thing. That's good news on both counts. For a moment, the air between them was still. The creek murmured over stone. Birds called in the cottonwoods. She felt the strange ache of something forming hope, or maybe gratitude wearing a new face. If he noticed the glimmer in her eyes, he was too kind to mention it. That night, as she blew out the lamp, Clara thought of how far she had come, from the girl who arrived bruised and frightened to the woman who now sang softly to herself, while the wind turned the pages of her life. The land had not healed her, not by itself, but it had given her a rhythm, a reason to stay upright, and Ethan, with his quiet decency, had given her space to breathe. In the dark, she whispered a small truth meant only for the night. "I'm not alone anymore." And somewhere across the hall, perhaps by instinct, Ethan stirred and smiled in his sleep. The summer light in Wyoming had a way of stretching time long, golden hours that softened even the hardest edges of memory. By June, the fields around the Walker Ranch had turned the color of honey. The creek ran low but steady, and Clara Bennett could almost believe the world had forgotten how to be cruel. Almost. That afternoon, she sat on the porch, mending a tear in Ethan's shirt. The sky shimmered with heat. Cicadas droned somewhere in the cottonwoods. Inside, the ticking clock marked each passing second with the same quiet insistence. Ethan was mending the corral fence, a silhouette moving steady against the light. It had been months since she'd arrived, months since she'd first stepped down from that stagecoach bruised and frightened. Life here had taken on rhythms slow, kind, deliberate, and yet some truths still waited, heavy as unspoken prayers. Ethan came up the steps, hat in hand, wiping his brow. "Storm's coming over the ridge," he said, looking west. "We'll want to bring in the tools before dark." She nodded. "I'll fetch them." He paused, noticing her hands trembling slightly as she folded the shirt. "You all right?" "Yes," she said too quickly, then caught herself. Yes, I'm fine." He didn't press. He never did. That, more than anything, frightened her, the quiet respect of a man who didn't demand to know, because sooner or later she would have to tell him the truth. The thought had haunted her since the day she'd arrived, riding beside him through the wild Wyoming wind. It wasn't fear of judgment. It was the fear of being seen. When the storm finally came, it was a gentle one, thunder rolling low, rain tapping the roof like a conversation between heaven and earth. Ethan had gone to the barn to check the horses. Clara stood by the window, watching sheets of rain blur the world into watercolor. The smell of wet pine filled the room, and something inside her loosened. Maybe it was the rain, or the safety she'd begun to trust. But that evening she decided to speak. When Ethan returned, soaked through, she met him by the fire with a towel and a tremor in her hands. He sat down, silent, and she poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "I've been meaning to tell you something," she began. He looked at her, expression unreadable. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but I need to." The fire cracked softly between them. Outside, the storm deepened, thunder rolling like an echo of her pulse. "I wasn't running from poverty," she said. "Not exactly. I was running from family." Ethan didn't move, only nodded once to show he was listening. "My parents died when I was 17, she continued. "After that, my mother's brother took me in, and my uncle, Richard Bennett." The name alone seemed to chill the air. He was respected in Boston, wealthy, generous in public, but inside his house, her voice faltered. Inside, he was cruel in quiet ways. He liked control. And when I turned 26, he decided I'd marry one of his business partners, a man twice my age, someone who could benefit his dealings. Ethan's eyes didn't leave her. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing nothing and everything at once. "I refused," she said, at first politely, then not so politely. "That's when the bruises started." She looked away, focusing on the rain running down the window. He said no woman under his roof would defy him. He took everything letters, money, my mother's ring. Said I'd marry or starve. Her hands tightened around the coffee mug. "One night, I found a newspaper with an advertisement, Western Bride Agency, discreet arrangements for respectable women. I wrote them a letter, using what little money I had hidden. They answered within a week. Said they'd find a man out west, someone quiet, someone honorable." She finally met Ethan's eyes. "They sent me to you." For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm outside seemed to hush, as if the land itself was listening. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "They were right," he said, "about me being quiet. Don't know about honorable." "You are," she said simply. He looked into the fire, the orange light reflecting in his eyes. "You came here to survive," he said, "not to love." Clara's breath caught. There was no accusation in his tone, only truth, a truth she had feared he'd speak aloud. "I didn't expect love," she said. "Not any more." He nodded slowly. "That's fair." The wind pushed against the shutters, then settled again. In the stillness, he added, "Whatever you left behind, it ends here. You don't owe me a thing, not your story, not your past, not a promise." Her voice trembled. "And what if I want to owe you? Gratitude's earned by both sides." He said, "You've given this place life again. That's no small thing." Later, as the rain eased into mist, Clara stepped outside onto the porch. The air smelled of wet sage and lightning. She could see the outline of the barn, where lantern light glowed faintly through the cracks. Somewhere inside, Ethan was tending the horses, same as he always did, steadfast, methodical, kind. She thought about Boston, about her uncle's house with its heavy curtains and whispered cruelty. She thought about the bruises that had once marked her skin and the silence she'd learned to wear like armor. Out here, under the vast Wyoming sky, silence meant something else entirely. It meant peace, safety, a chance to begin again. She lifted her face to the rain and let it fall. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch. Inside, Ethan watched from the doorway. He didn't call out to her. Some moments weren't meant to be interrupted. He only stood there, hat in hand, feeling something shift quietly in his chest, a weight he hadn't known he was carrying easing away. He'd built his life on solitude, believing it was safer that way. But watching Clara stand in the rain, head tilted toward the heavens, he realized solitude was not the same as peace. Peace was something shared, even if only in silence. He stepped out, just enough for the rain to touch his hands. She turned slightly, noticing him, and for a moment their eyes met through the dim light. No words passed between them. They didn't need any. In that stillness, they both understood what the agency letter had never said. Some people are not sent to each other for love at first, but for healing. Love comes later, like dawn after a long winter, and as the rain whispered its final song across the valley, Ethan thought maybe dawn has already begun. By mid-July, the valley around Willow Creek had turned the color of faded wheat, the air heavy with the smell of sun-warmed sage. The long Wyoming days stretched endlessly, spilling gold across the plains until even the shadows glowed. In that slow season between labor and rest, something in the Walker house began to change quietly, almost imperceptibly, like water seeping into dry earth. Clara Bennett had found her rhythm there. The once bare cabin now carried small traces of her, a sprig of wildflowers in a jar, curtains sewn from spare cloth, the soft hum of her voice when she worked. It wasn't decoration. It was presence. Ethan Walker noticed it without meaning to. Every evening when he came in from the fields, the scent of bread and wood smoke lingered, and the house no longer felt like it was waiting for something to fill it. He said little about it. Words had never been his trade, but one night, while mending a harness near the stove, he caught himself glancing toward her more often than toward the work in his hands. Clara sat by the fire, a book open on her knees, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek. She was reading aloud, not for him exactly, but for the room, as if the walls themselves deserved poetry. The winds of March will blow chill and cold, but hearts that keep warm will never grow old. Her voice was gentle, not trained like the women back east, yet it carried a steadiness that reached him. He set the harness aside, listening. She noticed after a moment and looked up, her smile uncertain. "Do you mind the noise?" she asked. He shook his head. "It's a good kind of noise." She blushed faintly and turned another page. The firelight wove through her hair, striking gold from chestnut strands. Ethan realized he was holding his breath. He looked away, embarrassed by the weight of the moment. Later, when she closed the book and stood to bank the fire, he said quietly, "You make the place feel right." She paused. "Right. Like it's been waiting for someone to speak again," he said, and left it there. Out here, that was as close to poetry as a man like him could manage. The days rolled on in a soft pattern work. Supper, quiet. They spoke more now, though never about what tied them together, the letter from the agency. The unsigned paper tucked away in the drawer. Instead, they talked about smaller things, whether the rain would hold, which hen was getting broody, how the stars seemed closer this far from town. The world outside could have forgotten them, and neither would have minded. One afternoon, while she hung linens to dry, Clara saw him in the field mending a broken gate. He worked shirt-sleeved, the sun tracing every motion, the slow, patient strength of a man who knew no other rhythm. Something in her chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and fear. She had told herself that love was a luxury meant for others, yet here it was, sneaking in through the quiet. She turned away quickly, ashamed of the warmth rising in her throat. He deserved peace, not a woman patched together from old sorrow. That evening, She brought a plate of fresh biscuits to the porch where he sat whittling. The air was cool, the light soft with the promise of night. "You'll spoil me," he said, "taking one." She smiled, sitting on the step below him. For a while, they watched the sky darken. "Do you miss Boston?" he asked suddenly. She thought a moment. Sometimes the sea, but not the life. Ethan nodded, his thumb running along the edge of the biscuit. "You ever think you might go back?" "No," she said simply. "Boston was a cage with windows. Here I can breathe." He studied her in the dim light, the honesty in her words settling deep inside him. "Then I'm glad you chose this place," he said, "even if it wasn't for me." Her head turned sharply at that. "Ethan," he raised a hand, "you don't owe me anything. Clara, not love, not promises. I need you to know that." "I do," she whispered, "but sometimes—" She hesitated. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to belong somewhere again." "You already do," he said, "whether or not there's a paper saying so." She looked at him then, eyes glimmering in the half-light. The moment held, delicate as a glass thread, until the wind shifted and the spell broke. She rose to go inside, but paused at the door. "You've given me something I never expected," she said softly, "a quiet kind of safety. I think that's worth more than love." Ethan watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading into the house. Safety first, he thought. Love can wait. As summer deepened, the bond between them settled into a steady pulse. They worked side by side, she tending the garden, he cutting hay for winter. When a calf was born weak one morning, they nursed it together through the night, taking turns with the lantern. The calf lived, and when it finally stood on its wobbly legs, Clara laughed an unguarded, radiant sound that startled them both. Ethan joined in, low and quiet, the sound of a man remembering joy. Afterward, she brushed her hair back, cheeks flushed. "I can't recall the last time I laughed like that." "Keep practicing," he said. "It suits you." That night, unable to sleep, Ethan sat by the window. The moonlight pooled across the floorboards, silvering the room. He thought of her laughter, the way it filled the spaces inside him that years of solitude had hollowed out. He'd known loneliness so long it had become a language. Now he was forgetting how to speak it. He didn't call what he felt love. Not yet. Love, he believed, was something earned through seasons, not moments. But the thought of her voice reading poetry, her hands coaxing life from soil, stayed with him like the faint scent of lavender that never quite left her room. When he finally stood, he whispered to the night, half to himself, half to her sleeping somewhere down the hall. "If ever there's a wedding here, it'll be because she chooses it." He meant it as a promise to her, and maybe to the man he still hoped to become. Weeks later, a sudden heat wave settled over the plains. Even the wind seemed too tired to move. One evening, Claire brought out a bowl of cold water for the dog and another for their feet. Ethan sat on the porch rail, watching her laugh as she splashed her toes, skirts gathered up to her knees. The sight was so ordinary, so full of life, it made his chest ache. She looked up at him then, water dripping from her fingers. "What are you staring at?" He smiled, slow and self-conscious. "Just something I never thought I'd see. What's that happiness? Here, of all places." Clara's smile softened. "Maybe that's where it hides. In places no one thinks to look." He nodded, the words settling between them like an old truth rediscovered. When the evening cooled, she fetched her book again and began to read by lamplight. He listened, as he always did, But tonight the words seemed written just for them, lines about storms endured and hearts rebuilt. The flames painted her face in gold and shadow. He realized, with a kind of quiet awe, that he was already lost, not in passion, but in peace. And peace, he thought, might be the truest form of love there was. By late August, the light in Wyoming had changed longer shadows, sharper winds that carried the faint scent of autumn. The valley around Willow Creek was quiet, save for the rustle of yellowing grass and the slow turn of the weather. Life on the Walker Ranch moved steady, each day folding into the next with the rhythm of two people who had found a fragile peace. Then came the letter from town. It was Sheriff Mason who brought it, riding up the trail one morning with dust on his coat and concern etched deep across his face. Ethan saw him from the barn and wiped his hands on a rag before stepping outside. Clara was in the garden, her bonnet tilted low, unaware. "Mornin', Sheriff," Ethan said. "Something wrong." Mason dismounted slowly, holding out a folded telegram. "Got this message from Denver," he said. "Name caught my eye. Thought you should see it first." Ethan unfolded the paper, reading in silence. The words were clipped. Formal inquiry from Richard Bennett, Boston businessman, traveling through Colorado, searching for niece, Clara Bennett, presumed missing, believes she was deceived by marriage correspondence, claims mental instability, potential danger to self. Ethan's jaw tightened. "He's looking for her," he said quietly. Mason nodded, asked about a woman answering her description. Last trace led toward Wyoming territory. He's been talking to folks in Denver, even the stage line. Might come this way if he's determined. Ethan folded the telegram and stared at the ground for a long moment. The earth was dry and cracked, the kind that kept secrets until rain came to loosen them. Finally, he asked, "Did you tell him anything?" "Only that there's no one by that name in Willow Creek," Mason said. "Figured you'd want the choice to tell her yourself." Ethan gave a slow nod. "Appreciate it." The sheriff hesitated. "You want my advice? If that man's half the snake you've hinted, best be ready. Papers or no papers, he'll say whatever gets him what he wants." "I know his kind," Ethan murmured. "Thank you, Mason." The sheriff climbed back into the saddle. "You let me know if he shows. I'll stand on your side. Walker. Always have." Ethan watched him ride away, dust trailing behind like smoke. For a moment he stayed still, listening to the wind through the grass. Then he turned toward the house. Clara looked up when he came through the gate. "Was that the sheriff?" He nodded, setting the telegram on the porch rail. He brought word from the east. Something in his tone froze her. She wiped her hands on her apron and came closer. "What kind of word?" He didn't answer right away. The air between them felt heavier than the sky. "Finally," he said, "your uncle. He's been asking after you. Says you were deceived. Says you're unwell." Her face drained of color. He told people that Ethan nodded once. Seems he's spreading the story through Denver. Might be headed this way. Clara's breath caught. "He'll try to drag me back. He'll make them believe I'm insane. Just like before." Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady. "He won't find you here, Clara, and if he does, he won't take you." She shook her head, tears threatening but held back. "You don't know him. He can twist anything. He'll make you think it's truth." "I've met enough men like him to know how they sound," Ethan said. "And I know you. That's truth enough." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "You should have married me when you had the chance. A paper might protect us." Ethan's eyes softened. but his voice remained calm. "No, Clara, I won't marry you to hide you. Not for his lies, not for anyone's. When it happens, if it happens, it'll be because you want it, not because you're running." Her hands trembled. "You'd risk him taking me." He met her gaze squarely. "I'd risk anything but your freedom." She turned away then, pressing a hand to her mouth. The silence that followed wasn't anger. It was fear, sharp and honest, the kind of fear that remembered too much. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by the hearth long after the fire had burned low, the telegram lying folded beside him. Outside, coyotes called across the hills, their voices echoing through the dark. He thought of Boston, of gaslight streets, and men like Bennett who measured worth in power, not mercy. Such men had no place here, yet they always found a way to spread their poison westward. He looked toward the closed door at the end of the hall, where Clara slept. "You're not alone now," he had told her once. The words felt heavier tonight. Protection wasn't a promise. It was a duty, one he intended to keep. Days passed without word. Clara worked harder than ever, as though motion could quiet the dread that shadowed her. Ethan noticed how her hands shook when she poured coffee, how she startled at distant hoofbeats. He wanted to ease it, but she had to meet the fear on her own terms. He'd learned enough about pain to know it couldn't be taken, only shared. One afternoon, as they loaded hay into the barn, she spoke without looking at him. "He'll come, you know." "Maybe," he said. "He'll say I'm ill, that I've lost my mind. He said that before, when I refused him, and people believed him." Ethan tossed the last bale into place. "I don't," she smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed wet. "That's what frightens me most, that you believe in me more than I do." He reached for the barn door, pulling it closed against the sun. That's how belief works. Clara, sometimes someone else holds it until you can again. By September, the rumor had reached town. A stranger from the east asking about a woman traveling under a false name. Some said he'd been seen at the depot, others near the saloon. Sheriff Mason kept watch, but no one had sighted him near the ranch yet. Still, every creak of the windmill made Clara flinch. That Sunday, Ethan hitched the wagon for supplies. Clara wanted to come, insisting she wouldn't hide. They rode the 10 miles into Willow Creek in near silence, dust rising behind the wheels. The town looked unchanged, same storefronts, same quiet church bell, but it felt different now, watched somehow. At the general store, people greeted them kindly, but their eyes lingered longer than usual. When Ethan stepped outside to load the feed sacks, Sheriff Mason was waiting by his horse. "He's here," Mason said low. "Came on the morning stage, checked into the hotel under his own name. Richard Bennett." Ethan's jaw tightened. "How long before he comes calling hard to say?" Mason replied, "He's asking questions, careful like. Says he's here on family business." Ethan nodded. "Then we'll stay ahead of him. Keep this between us for now." The sheriff tipped his hat. "You know I will." As they rode home, the sky burned with late summer fire. Clara watched the horizon, her hands twisting in her lap. "He's here, isn't he?" Ethan didn't answer right away. "Finally," he said. "Yes." Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. "Then it's begun." He glanced at her, the reins loose in his hands. "Whatever comes, you won't face it alone." She met his eyes then, a fragile steadiness returning. "You said that once before, and I'll keep saying it," he replied, "until you believe it's true." The wagon rolled on through the amber grass, the sun setting behind them in a blaze of gold. Neither spoke again, but the silence between them wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. Some storms came from the east, others from memory. Both had to be met head-on. And as the first stars appeared over the Wyoming plains, Ethan Walker knew the past had finally caught up, but so had courage. The Wyoming autumn came quietly, like someone drawing a wool blanket over the land. Mornings turned pale and still. Evenings burned gold before falling into long, blue shadows. At the Walker Ranch, everything seemed to breathe slower, the horses, the wind, even the light that spilled through the kitchen window at dusk. But beneath that stillness, something had changed between Ethan and Clara. The threat from the east lingered like a ghost. Neither spoke of. Yet its shadow had done something unexpected. It had drawn them closer, not by need, but by understanding. Ethan noticed it first, the way she'd rest her hand for a moment on the back of a chair before she spoke, steadying herself not from fear now, but from feeling. The way her laughter stayed longer after it came, not apologizing for itself. And sometimes, when the evening light caught her face, he would look away too late. He'd told himself it was wrong to hope. But the heart, like the land, heals where it's tended. That evening, the sky over Willow Creek was the color of amber whiskey. They had finished the day's work haystacked, the barn secured for an early frost. Ethan stood by the fence, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. Clara came from the house carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, steam curling in the cool air. "You'll freeze out here," she said softly. He took the cup, fingers brushing hers. "Guess I got used to the cold." She smiled faintly. "That sounds like something a lonely man would say." "Used to be true," he admitted. "Maybe not anymore." They stood side by side, the silence between them calm and full, the kind of silence people earn. The sun slipped lower, painting the fields in a tender light that made everything seem both eternal and fleeting. After a while, Clara spoke, her voice low. "When I first came here, I thought safety meant walls, locks, distance." She paused, watching the horizon. "But you've made me believe in something different. You've made me believe in safety again." Ethan turned toward her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the land, the place that had become her proof of peace. But her words struck him deeper than any gaze could. He set the cup down on the fence rail, his throat tight. "Then let's make it real." She turned to him then, eyes wide, uncertain. "Ethan." He stepped closer, not touching her, only standing near enough that his voice carried softly. "I don't mean out of fear, or for a paper's sake. You came here to survive. Now I want you to live. With me, if that's what you want." The wind tugged at her hair, lifting a strand across her cheek. She didn't move to brush it away. "And if I'm not ready," he smiled slow, tender, without a trace of disappointment, "then I'll keep waiting. Patience don't cost me anything. I've had years of practice." Her lips trembled into a smile that almost broke. "You make everything sound so simple." He shook his head. "It's not simple. It's just honest." They stayed like that, framed by the dying light, the woman who had run from cruelty, the man who had built his life in silence. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, long and low, like a prayer stretched thin across the plains. Clara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what this means to me." "Maybe not," he said, "but I know what you mean to me." She looked up at him then, really looked past the weathered skin and quiet eyes into the kind of steadiness that had carried her through every shadow of the past year. And for the first time in her life, she didn't flinch from what she felt. When he reached out, it wasn't command, or rescue, or claim. It was simply an offering, a hand open between them, waiting for hers. She placed her hand in his, small and trembling, but sure. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Clara Bennett," he said, voice low, "you've been walking beside me like you belong here all along. I don't know how to say the words right, but if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my days trying to keep you safe, and not because you need it, but because I want to." The world seemed to still. Even the wind quieted, as though listening. Clara's eyes filled, but her voice was steady. "You already have. Ethan, you've kept me safe in ways no one else ever did. And maybe that's why I love you." The words hung in the air plain, trembling, and more beautiful for their simplicity. He looked at her for a long time before speaking. "I don't deserve that," he said softly. "Maybe not," she said, smiling through her tears. "But neither do I. And maybe that's the point." The last light faded, leaving the world bathed in the deep blue of early night. He took a slow step forward, closing the small space left between them. For a moment, they just breathed the same air, their breath visible in the cooling dusk. When he finally kissed her, it was gentle, unhurried, like a promise whispered to the wind. Not a taking, but a meeting halfway. She leaned into it, one hand resting against his chest, where his heartbeat thudded like hooves across open land. When they parted, neither spoke. The words had already been said in every quiet act of the months behind them. He brushed a thumb along her cheek. "You're not alone now," he said. She smiled through the tears that caught the faint moonlight. "I know," she whispered. "Not anymore." Later, as they sat on the porch beneath the wide Wyoming sky, Clara rested her head on his shoulder. The stars were so bright they looked close enough to touch. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, the train rides, the fear, the bruises that had faded from her skin, but not from memory. And she thought of this man beside her, steady as the land itself. In another life, she might have met someone like him in a city ballroom and never noticed. But here, under the slow-turning stars, his silence spoke louder than any polished charm ever could. He reached for her hand, and she let him hold it. No words passed, only a deep, wordless knowing. Some loves didn't begin with thunder. Some began with the quiet decision to stay. The morning of their wedding broke quiet and cool, with frost still clinging to the grass along Willow Creek. The world seemed to hold its breath in that early light, gentle, unhurried, as if it knew this was not a day for grandness, but for grace. Ethan Walker rose before dawn, as he always did. He fed the horses, brushed them down, and stood for a while in the barn doorway, watching the first sunlight spread across the valley. The same sun had risen over 1,000 mornings before this one, but never had it felt quite like this, like it was beginning something, not simply continuing. He wasn't a man given to nerves, but that morning his hands wouldn't quite stay still. He caught himself smoothing his hair twice, then laughed under his breath. "Easy, Walker," he muttered. "You're not facing a gunfight." Outside, the ranch was still only the low cluck of hens and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the house, Clara Bennett, soon-to-be Clara Walker, was getting ready. He hadn't seen the dress yet, though she'd hinted it wasn't white. Too much like pretending, she'd said, half smiling. "I'll wear something that feels like me." That had made him smile, too. That was Clara, no pretense. No performance, just truth. Plain and beautiful as the land itself. The church in Willow Creek stood at the edge of town, a modest building of whitewashed boards and creaking pews. The steeple bell hadn't rung in weeks. Today, it would, inside. Pastor Reynolds lit 2 small candles on the altar. Sheriff Mason sat in the back row, hat in hand, his weathered face softened by the morning light. "You sure about this?" Ethan Mason had asked earlier, his tone more teasing than doubtful. "Sure as I've ever been," Ethan had said, and he was. The door opened just then, and conversation fell away. Clara stepped inside, her arm lightly resting on the pastor's wife's for steadiness. Her dress was soft blue, simple cotton with a ribbon at the waist, the same color as the sky over the hills after rain. She carried no bouquet, only a small sprig of lavender, the same scent that had once marked the letter that brought her here. Ethan turned as she entered, and the room seemed to shift around her. She didn't look like a woman rescued. She looked like a woman returned to herself. There was quiet strength in the way she held her chin, a steadiness that came from surviving the dark and stepping willingly into the light. When she reached him, he took her hands. His voice was rough from disuse and feeling. "You look," he started, then stopped, shaking his head softly. "You look like home." She smiled. "So do you." Pastor Reynolds cleared his throat gently, though there was a kind twinkle in his eye. "Shall we begin?" They stood together as the pastor spoke of union, not as escape, but as choice. He spoke of patience, of the way love grows like seasons quiet, sure, and worth the waiting. Mason nodded along, as though the words reminded him of something long past but still true. When the vows came, they were brief. Ethan's voice was steady. "I promise to stand beside you, to give you peace, not walls, to protect what we build, and never take what isn't freely given." Clara's words trembled only once. "I promise to stay not out of need, but out of trust. You've shown me what kindness sounds like. I'll spend my days trying to echo it." The pastor smiled, his voice warm as the morning light. "Then by the grace of God and the goodwill of this town, I declare you husband and wife." No one clapped. There was no need. The silence that followed was fuller than any cheer could have been. Ethan reached for her hand, and she gave it freely. They left the church together, the wooden doors swinging wide to the open sky. Outside, the wind moved gently through the grass, as if the land itself was offering its blessing. They rode home in the wagon, side by side. Clara's blue dress fluttered softly in the breeze, her lavender sprig tucked behind her ear. "We'll go at your pace," Ethan said quietly. "Always." She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You've said that before, and I meant it," he replied. "A man can't hurry what's meant to grow slow." Her smile came like sunlight breaking through cloud. "Then we'll grow slow," she said. They drove the rest of the way in silence, the sound of the wheels and the soft creak of leather filling the air like a hymn. That evening, the small cabin glowed with firelight. The supper was simple roast chicken, bread still warm from the oven, a bottle of cider Mason had left on the porch as a gift. Outside, crickets sang. Inside, the world seemed small and endless, all at once. After dinner, Ethan rose to stir the fire. Clara watched him, the play of light across his face, the ease in his movements. When he turned, she was standing close behind him. "I used to think love had to be loud," she said quietly, "like in the story's grand gestures, big words, But this feels more real." He reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Loud things fade," he said. "Quiet things last." She looked up at him, eyes shining, then let this last. He hesitated only long enough to see she meant it. Then he bent and kissed her slowly, reverently, as though he feared the moment might break if he moved too fast. She answered the kiss with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through everything else. It was not the kind of passion that burns quick and bright. It was the kind that takes root and endures. When they finally drew apart, the fire had burned low. The cabin was hushed, the night pressing close around them. Ethan spoke first, his voice rough with tenderness. "Nothing that hurt you before will happen here," he said. "Not ever." Clara's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "I know," she whispered, "because I trust you." He took her hand then, leading her toward the soft glow of the lamplight. The rest of the night passed in warmth and silence, two hearts learning the shape of safety in each other's arms. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of lavender from the windowsill. The stars were sharp and clear over the valley. From somewhere far off, a lone coyote sang, its cry not of sorrow, but of belonging. Inside, Ethan and Clara lay awake for a long while, listening to the wind against the roof, the slow rhythm of shared breathing. Neither spoke. There were no words left that could improve the quiet. Later, as sleep came, Ethan thought not for the first time that maybe heaven wasn't some far place of light, but the simple peace of knowing another soul had chosen to stay. By late winter, the snow in Willow Creek had begun to melt, turning the main road into a slow-moving river of mud and hoofprints. The church bell rang only on Sundays now, and the townsfolk had grown used to seeing Ethan and Clara Walker together, he steady and quiet. She with that gentle grace that made people lower their voices when she passed. Life had begun to feel like it might stay peaceful, until the morning the stranger arrived. He came in on the stagecoach from Denver, wearing a dark wool coat that didn't quite fit the dust of Wyoming. His hat was Eastern, his boots polished too clean for the plains. When he stepped down from the coach, his eyes scanned the street with the restless ownership of a man who thought every soul he met owed him something. Richard Bennett had finally come west. Sheriff Mason saw him first. He was standing on the porch of the general store, sipping coffee from a tin cup, when the stranger asked after a Mrs. Clara Walker, née Bennett, of Boston. Mason set his cup down. "You're her kin." "I take it." "Her guardian," Bennett corrected sharply. "The girl's underage. She's been led astray by some opportunist out here. I'm here to bring her home." Mason studied him a moment, this man with the soft hands and the hard mouth. "You got papers?" Bennett smiled thinly. "I have everything I need." Word traveled fast in small towns, carried by glances and half-whispered questions. By noon, Ethan knew. He hitched his horse without a word, the leather creaking under his grip. Clara tried to follow, but he turned to her gently. "Stay here," he said. "Let me see what he wants." Her hand caught his sleeve. "He'll lie. Ethan. He always does." He met her eyes. "Then we'll tell the truth." The sheriff's office sat at the corner of Main and Willow, a narrow room with a stove, 2 chairs, and 1 iron-barred cell that hadn't seen much use in years. When Ethan walked in, Bennett was already there, pacing like a lawyer before a jury. Mason sat behind his desk, the picture of calm. "Mr. Walker," Bennett said, turning, "I presume you're the man who's taken it upon himself to play husband to my niece." Ethan didn't answer right away. He simply removed his hat, set it on the desk, and looked at the man squarely. "She's my wife, and she's not your ward anymore." Bennett laughed a brittle sound, sharp as glass. "Your wife. That marriage isn't worth the ink it's written with. Clara's 17. She's not of age to marry without consent." Mason leaned forward in his chair, unhurried. "Funny thing, Mr. Bennett. I sent word to Boston when this all first came up. The records there show Clara Bennett born April 5th, 856. That makes her 27 by my count." Bennett froze. "That's impossible. I have her certificate, which you forged," came a voice from the doorway. Clara stood there, pale but steady, her gloved hands clasped before her. She'd walked all the way from the ranch to town after Ethan left, following the trail she'd spent years running from. Now, she met her uncle's eyes without flinching. "You forged it after my parents died," she said quietly, "so you could claim their estate. You told everyone I was a child too young to inherit. And when I turned 21, you said I was unstable." The room went still. Even the stove's low crackle seemed to fade. Bennett's jaw tightened. "That's slander. It's truth," she said. "And you know it. I have the letters you sent to the attorney. You signed them yourself." Mason leaned back, slow as a man savoring justice. "So it seems to me, Mr. Bennett, that Mrs. Walker here is a legal adult, legally married, and legally free from any claim you think you have." Bennett's composure cracked just enough for Ethan to see the fury underneath. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You think you can hide her out here among dirt farmers and fools? You've taken what isn't yours." Ethan's voice stayed calm, but his eyes turned cold. "She's not something to take, and she's not afraid of you anymore." Bennett turned toward Clara, his face twisting. "You'll regret this, girl. You'll regret throwing away everything that was yours." Clara's reply came soft, but it cut through the room like light through storm cloud. "I already have. And now I'm free." Bennett left town that afternoon. Mason saw to it himself, riding with him to the stage depot to make sure he boarded. No one said goodbye. He didn't look back. Men like him rarely did. They just carried their pride like armor and hoped no one noticed the dents. When the coach disappeared down the road, Mason exhaled, tipping his hat against the wind. "Guess that's one less ghost to haunt this place," he murmured. Back in town, Ethan and Clara stood on the church steps, the same ones where they'd spoken their vows only weeks before. She watched the horizon where the coach had gone, her hands folded tightly in front of her. "He's really gone," she said, almost in disbelief. Ethan nodded. "He's gone. You stood your ground. Clara, you did what no one else ever could." She turned to him then, eyes bright, a single tear catching the light. "I thought I'd feel anger," she said, "or relief, but I just feel still. That's what peace feels like," he said. She smiled faintly. "It's quieter than I expected." He took her hand in his. "Quiet's not so bad. You can hear things in it, the wind, the land, your own heart." They stood that way for a long time, as the sun sank low and painted the fields in soft gold. The same wind that once carried fear now carried something gentler, like forgiveness, or maybe simply time. That night, back at the ranch, Clara took down the small wooden box she kept on the shelf above the hearth. Inside were the few pieces of her past she hadn't yet thrown away: a locket, a letter, and now, folded neatly on top, the forged birth certificate her uncle had once used to own her life. She fed it to the fire without a word. The flames caught quickly, curling the paper into bright ash. Ethan watched from the doorway. You sure you don't want to keep it?" She shook her head. "No. The past doesn't need to be proof anymore." He nodded, stepping beside her as the last of the document turned to smoke. "Then let it go. Outside." The night spread calm and wide over the plains. The coyotes called again, their voices softer now, less lonely. The old ghost had been put to rest. For the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach months ago, Clara Walker felt the world stop demanding her defense. She was not someone's ward, someone's mistake, someone's burden. She was her own. And when Ethan took her hand, she knew she was not alone in that, either. By the time the first snow came to Willow Creek, the world around the Walker Ranch had turned to quiet silver. The mountains wore their white coats again, and the river froze over in thin glass sheets that caught the morning sun like shards of light. The air carried that familiar scent of wood smoke and cold pine, a smell that, to some, meant loneliness, but to Ethan and Clara Walker, it meant home. Ethan rose before dawn, as always. The horses snorted in the barn, their breath steaming in the dim light. He worked slower now, careful not to make too much noise, inside the cabin. Clara slept near the fire, her rounded belly rising gently beneath the quilt. Sometimes he paused at the window just to watch her breathe, amazed by how something so small and quiet could make a man feel richer than all the gold in the Black Hills. They hadn't had visitors in weeks, so for Sheriff Mason bringing mail once or twice. The storms had begun early this year, cutting the road to town most days, but neither of them minded much. The isolation that once felt like exile had turned into sanctuary. The silence no longer pressed. It soothed. That morning, Clara woke to the sound of Ethan hammering in the workshop. She smiled to herself, pulling the quilt closer. The baby shifted slightly inside her, a reminder of how near the time was. She sat up, rubbing her stomach. "Your father's at it again," she whispered. "He's been building something every day since the snow fell." When she went out to the barn later, she found out what it was: a cradle, smooth and sturdy, made from the pine they'd felled together last autumn. Ethan stood over it, sanding the last edge. His hair, darker now with the damp, fell across his forehead. "You're supposed to be resting," he said without turning. "I can't rest while you're working this hard," she replied. "You'll wear yourself out before the baby comes." He smiled a little. "Reckon that's the idea. I like the thought of having something ready." Clara ran her fingers along the cradle's curved edge. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Did you decide on a name yet?" He looked up then, his eyes warm. "We said we'd wait." "I know," she said softly, "but I keep thinking if it's a boy, Samuel Walker feels right." Ethan nodded. "Solid name, strong. And if it's a girl—" Clara paused, her voice turning tender. Amelia Walker." He said the name once under his breath, as if testing how it fit in the world. "Amelia," he repeated. "Sounds like something that would make the angels listen." By mid-December, the cabin looked almost festive. Ethan had brought in a pine from the ridge, not tall but full and green. Clara decorated it with what they had dried berries, bits of ribbon, small carvings Ethan had made from scrap wood. She tied a strip of blue cloth around the top branch, the same blue from her wedding dress. "That's all we need," she said when they were done. "Something simple, something real." He stood back, wiping his hands. "Looks like Christmas to me." That night they sat by the fire, the tree glowing faintly in the corner. Ethan carved quietly while Clara knitted. Her hands moved slowly, now deliberate, patient, She was making a scarf for him, deep gray wool, long enough to wrap twice around his neck. He watched her from time to time, listening to the rhythm of the needles. "You'll spoil me," he said. She smiled. "Someone has to." The baby kicked just then, and she laughed softly. You feel that he nodded, placing his hand gently against her belly. The movement beneath his palm was small, but certain. He looked at her, his voice low. "Hard to believe something like that's real." "It's the most real thing there is," she said. "After everything, this feels like the world saying we made it." The days passed slower after that. As winter deepened, outside, snow fell in thick, quiet waves. Inside, the cabin filled with the sounds of life, a kettle whistling, the crack of wood in the stove, the occasional hum of Clara's voice when she thought he wasn't listening. Sometimes she'd hum the same tune he'd heard her sing under her breath when she first arrived. Something from Boston. Maybe, though it had changed here, softened by the open sky. At night, they'd sit on the porch for a few minutes before bed, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars above the frozen fields. The silence between them was comfortable now, full of unspoken gratitude. "I used to think winter was the hardest season," Clara said one night. "Cold, lonely, but it feels different now." Ethan looked out across the snow-covered valley. "It's quieter," he said. "Gives a man time to hear his heart." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then maybe that's what love really is, finding peace where there used to be emptiness." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just reached for her hand, holding it there until the cold made them go back inside. Christmas Eve came with another snowfall. Clara was slower that morning, moving carefully, but still insisting on baking bread. Ethan stayed close, keeping the fire high, making sure the paths to the barn stayed clear. Around noon, Mason rode up with his coat dusted in white and a parcel tucked under one arm. "Got something for the little one," he said, grinning as he stepped inside. "Figured it's better early than late." Clara laughed, taking the bundle. Inside was a small quilt, hand-stitched with patches from the townsfolk scraps of old shirts, curtains, even a piece of the church flag. "They all pitched in," Mason said. "Figured the first baby born in Willow Creek in 2 years deserved a proper welcome." Clara's eyes filled. "Tell them thank you," she said softly. "All of them." "Already did," Mason said, tipping his hat. "Merry Christmas. Walkers." After he left, Clara spread the quilt across the cradle. It fit perfectly. She looked over at Ethan. "It's strange, isn't it? We came here strangers, and now it feels like we belong to this place." Ethan nodded, his voice gentle. "Belonging's not something a place gives you, Clara. It's something you give back." That night, the storm thickened, wrapping the cabin in a deep, white hush. The fire burned steady, the tree lights flickered soft. Clara sat near the hearth, finishing the last row on Ethan's scarf. He sat beside her, carving the final detail on the cradle's headboard a single word, carved clean and sure: hope. When he was done, he looked over at her. She smiled, tired but peaceful. "You think she'll like it?" He teased. "You sound pretty sure." "Call it a feeling," she said, resting her hand over her heart. "This winter's too kind not to give us a daughter." He reached for her hand then, lacing his fingers through hers. "Then Amelia it is." They sat that way for a long time. The world outside lost to snow and silence, the fire casting golden light across the room. The cradle stood ready, the quilt in place, the scarf folded neatly on the chair. There was nothing left to fear, nothing left undone. Ethan thought of how far they'd come from the lonely man who'd once written a letter scented with lavender to the woman who now made this cabin glow from within. The years of emptiness had led them here, to warmth, to laughter, to the quiet promise of new life. And in that moment, as the wind whispered against the windows, he knew this was home. The storm came in fast from the north, rolling over the ridge like a gray wall. By late afternoon, the wind had swallowed the valley, bending the trees and sending snow swirling across the barnyard in wild, restless circles. The air was so thick with white that even the fence posts disappeared into it. Ethan Walker had gone to town that morning, planning to trade for flour, lamp oil, and a bolt of cloth Clara had mentioned weeks before. He'd promised he'd be back before dark. But by the time he left Mason's store, the snow had already started to fall fine at first, then heavier, until the horse's hooves sank deep into the drifts. He leaned forward in the saddle, urging the mare on. Each mile home felt longer than the one before. He thought of the cabin, the fire, and the way Clara's hand always found his when the wind howled outside. She'd smiled that morning, told him not to worry, the baby's content to wait. She'd said, "But storms have their own timing, and so do new lives." Back at the ranch, Clara was alone when the first pain struck. It came sharp and deep, cutting through her breath like lightning through still air. She dropped the cup she was drying. It shattered on the floor. For a moment she stood there, her hands gripping the table, trying to will the world steady again. The second pain came quicker. She knew that waiting was over. The baby wasn't listening to plans. She moved slowly to the bedroom, each step deliberate, her heart pounding. The storm roared outside, shaking the windows. "Not now," she whispered, as if the weather might listen. "Please, not yet. But life, like weather, rarely waits for permission." When another contraction doubled her over, she made a choice. She bundled herself in her shawl, stepped into the cold, and half walked, half stumbled toward the Whitmore's cabin down the hill. Mrs. Whitmore was the only woman nearby with any skill in childbirth. The snow hit her face in hard, stinging bursts. The world narrowed to the sound of her own breath and the wind. Twice she fell. Twice she got up again. By the time she reached the Whitmore porch, she could barely speak. She knocked once, then again, before the door opened. "Clara, Lord above come in, Mrs.?" Whitmore's strong arms caught her just as her knees gave out. Ethan reached the edge of his land at dusk. The wind had slowed, but the snow was deep enough to choke the horses. He could see the light in the cabin window, a faint, steady glow. He smiled with relief. "Almost there," he murmured. Then he saw the tracks. They led away from the cabin, down the hill. Small steps, half dragged, half determined. A woman's steps. His heart clenched. Clara. He didn't think. He just ran when he burst through the Whitmore's door. The room was filled with firelight and the scent of boiling water. "Mrs." Whitmore looked up from the bedside. "You made it just in time," she said briskly. "She's strong, but the baby's impatient." Clara lay against the pillows, her face pale, hair damp with sweat. When she saw him, she tried to smile. "You came back," she breathed. "I told you I would," he said, taking her hand. "I always will." The storm howled outside, shaking the windows. Inside, the world shrank to the rhythm of breath and pain. "Mrs." Whitmore moved with calm precision, her voice low and sure. "Steady now. Clara. That's it, breathe. Time lost meaning." The minutes stretched and folded until only effort and hope remained. Ethan sat beside her, his rough hands trembling slightly as he brushed the hair from her face. "You're doing fine," he whispered. "Better than fine." "I can't," she gasped once. The pain too much. But then she looked at him, saw the quiet certainty in his eyes, and found strength somewhere deep inside. "Yes," she said, almost to herself. "I can." And then at last there was a cry, thin but fierce, rising above the storm. The kind of sound that fills a room with light. "Mrs." Whitmore lifted the small, wriggling bundle into her arms, smiling through tears. "A girl," she said, "healthy as can be." Clara's head fell back against the pillow, her breath shaking. Ethan could only stare. He'd seen storms, fires, births of calves and dawns after endless nights. But nothing had ever felt like this. The tiny fist, the first breath, the fragile strength of it. It was as if the world itself had started over. "Mrs." Whitmore placed the baby in Clara's arms. "Say hello to your daughter," she said softly. Clara looked down, her eyes wide and shining. "Amelia?" she whispered. "Amelia Walker." Ethan knelt beside them, one hand resting gently on Clara's shoulder. He bent his head close, his voice barely audible. "She's perfect." Clara smiled through tears. "She's ours." Outside. The storm began to ease, its fury spent. The wind softened, the snow settling into peace. Inside. The fire burned low and steady. The only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the small, steady breaths of the newborn child. Later, when the worst of the night had passed and Mrs. Whitmore had gone to make tea, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, holding the baby. She was light as air, warm against his chest. He could feel the tiny pulse beneath her skin, strong and insistent. Clara watched him, her smile tired but full. "She looks like you," she said. He shook his head. "No. She looks like she belongs to the world." Clara reached out, tracing the baby's cheek with her finger. "Do you remember what you said the day I came to Willow Creek?" He nodded slowly. I said, "You're not alone now." She smiled. "You kept your word." Ethan looked down at the small face against his arm, then at the woman who had turned his lonely house into a home. He leaned close, pressing his lips to Clara's forehead, then to the baby's. "We're not alone anymore," he whispered, and for the first time in his life, he truly believed it. Outside, the snow glowed faintly under a breaking sky. The storm had passed. Dawn came soft and pink over the hills, touching the cabin windows with light. The world was silent, except for the newborn's breathing and the slow, steady rhythm of a heart at peace. The land would wake soon. The cattle would stir. The river would thaw. And another long Wyoming winter would begin to loosen its hold. But for now, in that small, warm room, time stood still. And if anyone had been standing outside that cabin just then, they might have heard it too. The sound of life finding its way through the cold. The sound of love made visible. The valley of Willow Creek had changed, though not in the way cities did. It didn't grow louder or brighter, it grew fuller. Fields that once lay bare now shimmered with green. The fence lines stretched farther than they used to, and the Walker Ranch, once a small patch of stubborn survival, had become a place people pointed to with quiet respect. 5 winters had come and gone since the night the storm broke and Amelia Walker entered the world. She was 5 now, freckled, fearless, and forever running where she wasn't supposed to. Her laughter carried across the pasture like birdsong, weaving through the sound of the wind and cattle lowing in the distance. Ethan Walker had learned to grow slower in those 5 years. His hair had gone gray at the temples, but his eyes still held that steady, unshakable calm. The man who once spoke little now spoke often but softly. When neighbors came by to trade or talk, he listened more than he answered, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. They called him the steady man of Willow Creek. He never corrected them. Clara, too, had changed, but her strength had only deepened. She taught Amelia how to tend the garden behind the house, how to dig in the soft soil, when to water, and how to whisper to the seedlings as if they could hear. Everything that's alive listens, she told her daughter. The earth, the wind, even your own heart. Behind them, the sound of small boots pounding on the porch broke the quiet. Jacob Walker, barely 3, came barreling into the sunlight with a wooden toy horse in his fist. He tripped once, caught himself, and laughed like falling was just another part of running. "Mama," he shouted, "Papa's coming." Clara looked up from her kneeling place among the cabbages. Down the hill. Ethan was walking toward them, a shovel over his shoulder, his hat pushed back. The late spring sun lay across the land in warm stripes of gold. He stopped by the oak tree where the swing hung, its ropes worn smooth from Amelia's constant use. "All right," he called, his voice carrying easily. "Who's ready to plant something worth keeping?" Amelia squealed and ran to him, her small hands clutching a sapling they'd been tending in a pot all winter. "This one's mine," she said. "You promised I could plant it myself." Ethan crouched beside her. "That's right, but trees don't belong to people. Sweetheart, we just take care of them." She frowned thoughtfully. "Then who do they belong to?" He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "To the world, maybe, to everything that breathes." Jacob toddled up behind them, holding a handful of wildflowers he'd crushed in his grip. "For Mama," he said proudly. Ethan laughed. "Standing." "Then I guess we'd better get to work before she comes asking where her flowers went." They dug the hole together, Ethan steadying the roots, Amelia patting the dirt in small clumps, Jacob trying to help, but mostly scattering soil everywhere. Clara stood at the porch, watching them, her hands resting on her apron. It wasn't pride she felt. Not exactly. It was something quieter, something deeper, the kind of peace that comes when you realize you've made it through the storm, and all that's left is to keep living kindly. When the sapling was finally standing, straight and sure, Ethan brushed the dirt from his hands and looked around at his family. "Everybody loves everybody," he said softly. Amelia tilted her head. "That's not how the preacher says it." Ethan chuckled. "Maybe not, but it's how it works out here." Clara came down from the porch then, the sunlight glinting off the small silver locket she still wore, the only piece she'd kept from Boston. She slipped an arm around Ethan's waist, her eyes on the tree. "What kind is it?" "Cottonwood," he said. "Same as the ones by the creek. They'll talk to each other when the wind blows." "I like that," she said. "Nothing alone, not even trees." He nodded, and for a long moment they stood in silence, the 4 of them framed by the open Wyoming sky. The wind moved through the grass, bending it in soft waves, and somewhere far off, a hawk cried over the ridge. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Ethan sat by the window with a cup of coffee gone cold. The stars were sharp and endless above the plains. Clara came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "You're thinking again," she murmured. "Just remembering," he said. "How quiet it used to be before all this." She smiled against his neck. "You used to like the quiet." "I still do." he said, "but it sounds different now." She tilted her head. "How so?" He looked at her then, his voice low and certain. "It used to sound like being alone. Now it sounds like peace." The next morning, Mason rode up from town with the mail. He looked older, too slower on his horse, but his grin hadn't changed. He handed Ethan a letter. "Came all the way from Boston," he said, marked legal notice. "You'd best read it." Ethan opened it at the porch rail. The words were formal, stamped in ink and sealed with the mark of a lawyer's hand. "Richard Bennett, deceased, carriage accident, Boston, estate dissolved, no heirs." Ethan read the lines twice before folding the paper again. Mason watched him. "You gonna tell Clara, yeah?" Ethan said quietly, "but I don't think it'll change much." When he told her that evening, she just nodded, eyes distant for a moment, then turned back to stir the stew on the stove. "I thought I'd feel something," she said after a long silence, "but I don't. Maybe I already said goodbye to that part of me." Ethan touched her shoulder. "You did, a long time ago." That summer was a good one. The rains came when they were needed. The cattle thrived. And every morning, the sun rose over the cottonwood tree by the porch taller now, its leaves trembling with sound. Amelia would sit beneath it, reading aloud from the small book of poems her mother had once carried from Boston, while Jacob ran in circles around her, wooden horse in hand. Sometimes, Ethan would stop his work just to listen. The child's voice, the rustle of leaves, the low hum of life, it all blended into something so complete, so whole, that it made his chest ache in the best way. One afternoon, as he and Clara watched the children from the porch, she took his hand and said quietly, "Do you ever miss the old days, Ethan? Before all this?" He thought about it for a long moment, then shook his head. "No," he said. "The man I was back then wouldn't have known what to do with this kind of happiness." She smiled, leaning into him. "Then we'll just keep learning." The wind lifted her hair, and in the distance, the cottonwoods whispered like old friends. The sun hung low and golden over the fields, casting long, gentle shadows. The world was still rough out there. There would always be storms, droughts, losses. But here, in this small piece of Wyoming earth, the Walkers had built something that outlasted fear. Ethan squeezed her hand. "Everybody loves everybody," he said again, almost to himself. And she answered the way she always did, with a smile that caught the light. Together, they stood beneath the vast, forgiving sky, their children laughing in the grass, the land alive around them. It was not a perfect world, but it was theirs. And in that quiet place between memory and hope, the story of Ethan and Clara Walker came full circle from loneliness to family, from fear to peace, from silence to the soft, steady rhythm of love. Thank you for watching Frontier Hearts, the story of Ethan and Clara Walker. A story not about perfection, but about healing, about two souls who found peace not in grand gestures, but in the small, quiet moments of trust. If you've stayed with us until the end, through the snowstorm, the silence, the first cry of baby Amelia, then perhaps you felt it too. That deep, unspoken truth of the frontier, no one truly heals alone. Ethan and Clara's journey reminds us that even after the hardest winters, there's always a sunrise waiting. Their love wasn't born of rescue, but of gentleness, of choosing, every day, to be kind in a world that often forgets how. And maybe, somewhere in your own life, there's a Wyoming too, a place where you're learning to trust again, to start over, to love quietly but completely. If this story touched your heart, Please help us keep telling stories like it. Like this video if you believe in second chances. Share it with someone who might need to hear they're not alone now. And subscribe to Frontier Hearts, where every week we honor the untold lives, loves, and small acts of grace that built the American frontier. Until next time, keep your fire warm, your heart open, and your hope alive. This is Frontier Hearts.